So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the flop check raising strategies, big blind out of position as preflop caller. I understood there was already a webinar done on check raising, but this specific spot I think is very important. So therefore I chose this one. The smaller your opponent c-bets, the higher his frequency and the more linear his range, the more we will check raise. Okay. The bigger your opponent c-bets, the more his range is polarized, the less we check raise. Therefore, I will be focusing in this webinar, since we only have an hour, I will be mainly focusing on facing small c-bets. I will touch a little bit on when we check raise, when the c-bet is half pot or maybe even 3/4, which only happens in a couple of situations, but I want to mainly focus on the 1/3, facing the 1/3 c-bet, which is also the most common sizing, okay? And this is mainly why we would check raise a lot versus small and not check raise a lot versus big. So I will give you guys a couple of guidelines for flop, then we will jump into some examples. Afterwards, I'll give you guys some guidelines for playing turns and river after having check raised. And again, we will look at some examples. All right, sounds good. We check raise from an overall and not equity advantage, both now and in the future. And you hear me say this, I think, in every webinar where I talk about future. That's because I'm a cash game player. We play at high SPRs, and taking future runouts and future equity switches in consideration is very important when you play deep. Okay, so we track raise from an overall and not equity advantage, both now and in the future. The more you have it, the higher our raising frequency. It's the same with backdown frequencies. We're investing in an equity advantage, all right? We don't do much slow playing as a default. Unless villain has a big not equity advantage, both now and in the future, and or if the board is going to change very often. So take web boards as a high SPR. So big not equity advantage, for example, would be an ace, king, something board, and he makes a big c-bet. So these are like both combined, or like a triple Broadway board. These boards are often going to change in the future and offer in the advantage for the imposition. So no point at a high SPR in building a pot straight away. Okay. If the board is a bit more wet, or villain does have some sort of a not equity advantage, but we have a lot of vulnerable top pairs at low SPR situations, if you, for example, play a tournament, you will actually see check raising. And this is basically because we don't have to maneuver rivers. Okay. When the SPR is small, we can check raise way more on the flop, because basically on the turn, we just shove it in. And that's where the game ends. We don't have to maneuver rivers. All right. The deeper you get, the more careful you have to be. As a default guideline, your check raise sizing, or this is the one that I would recommend to you, if you go over all boards, usually you will check raise around 3/4 pot, half pot to 3/4. That's kind of, so you could say 2/3 would be roughly the average check raise sizing. Okay. So if you would build your own strategies, I would usually recommend using 3/4 pot. There are some examples. There's some exceptions. Low pair boards, for example, you usually check raise half pot. We can size down when your check raising range becomes more linear. So take, for example, 4, 6, 8 facing a 1/3 c-bet. We want to be check raising a lot for sort of protection. 6, 7, more 8x, more top pairs. So pocket sevens, maybe 4, 5, 6, 5, these type of hands. So we will do a smaller check raise sizing. It's the same on, for example, low paired boards. All right. Or if villain uses a bigger c-bet sizing on a low board like this, when it's disconnected, let's say someone bets half pot 3/4, we actually make very small check raises because we're trying to make his bluffs indifferent, which are hands like 10, jack, jack, queen, jack 10. And he's a bit more polarized if you use a bigger sizing. So as we explained earlier, then we usually don't do a lot of check raising, but since the board is low, we do benefit from some protection if we have a hand like 9-8, for example. So 9-8, for example, would be a hand that could check raise here for a small sizing versus bigger c-bet. In general, you start to size up when your range becomes more polarized. So think on an ace 8-6, on a king queen 4. We basically are check raising top pair, very good kicker plus. Okay, so if you think about what kind of sizing would go with, let's say, a 2-pair plus range, a big sizing. So here we would probably go towards pot, and here we go towards half pot. But as a default, somewhere between 60–80% of the pot is going to be the default sizing. Okay, this is what I would recommend you guys using. Finding value in the check raise, as we just explained, we're not going to do too much slow playing. And actually, the reason why we don't really do much slow playing, let me elaborate on that, is let's say we face a 1/3 c-bet and we just check call a strong hand and turn goes check, check. Then we're on the river and the pot is still very small. So since we're out of position, we usually want to check raise straight away to make sure that we build a pot. Okay, that's the main reason. The other reason is people then sometimes say, shouldn't we protect our range? Well, you will make new 2 pairs on the turn. You will make new nuts on the turn. Okay, so it's not really something that you have to worry about all that often. So I usually recommend just check raising most of your strong hands. All right, so unless he has another advantage or the board is very wet, yeah, that would be my general guideline. Then people say if someone is very aggressive, I think in my opinion, if someone is very aggressive, I think your bluff catchers then start to just make a lot more money. So on the turn, if someone's very aggressive, you just call more of your bluff catchers. I don't think there's a lot of point in moving a lot of strong hands to the turn, but that's I'm sure there's people who have various opinions on that. So which type of bluffs to add on the flop in this order? So I kind of ordered, if you want to add bluffs to your value range, where do you start? Well, the first one is strong draws. So flush draws, open-ended straight draws. The second one will be weaker draws. So this will be gutters. The third one will be backdoor draws, usually a backdoor flush, backdoor straight, plus an overcard. And the last resort would be bottom pairs with backdoor draws. Okay. So if there's a flop where you have a lot of draws to your disposal, okay, usually you start with the highest frequency is going to be your strong draws, then your weaker draws, and backdoor draws will be a smaller proportion of the check raising range, and we will almost not check raise any bottom pairs. But there are also boards where there's just no flush draws, for example, available because the board is rainbow and there's very little open-ended straight draws. Then we would just check raise our weaker draws at a higher frequency. So knowing this, also, if we are the in position as an initial raiser and we face a check raise, if we want to estimate if it's likely that our opponent is over bluffing, well, are there a lot of strong draws and weaker draws available? The more gutters, straight draws, flush draws you flop as the big blind, the more careful you have to be with check raising them all. So it's good to have this order of importance top of mind. Could you please explain again why on boards favorable for the in position we check raise bigger? No, you check raise bigger because if the board is favorable for the in position, we do little check raising. So we basically only check raise a very strong range. So let's say 2 pair plus, and therefore the check raise sizing will be bigger. All right. But our check raise frequency will go down if the board is not favorable for us. If the board is favorable, so like a low pair board, we check raise a lot. If it's unfavorable for us, like a triple Broadway or like an ace king X type of boards, we check raise very little. All right. I will now. Oh, wait. Last point I wanted to make. If you want to increase your check raise frequency, okay, and barrel frequency, you should look for boards that are over c-bet. So how do you do that? You can go, for example, to Wizard. You go to the aggregated reports. You look at, okay, which boards are c-bet at a low frequency. And then you could compare that to pool data using, for example, hand to node, holder manager. And you can see, you make an alias of your pool, how much people are actually c-betting. And then if you find boards that are over c-bet, you can up your check raise frequency. Now, you don't have to go bananas and suddenly check raise, you know, complete nonsense hands. No, you basically go back to this guide and you check raise. You start with check raising all your strong draws. Then you start to check raise all your weaker draws. If you think your opponent's even c-betting even more or folding too much to check raise, you check raise all your backdoor draws. Also, your definition of what's a backdoor draw starts to become a little bit more loosely. And then at some point, you know, we will reach a very high frequency. Okay. But you don't have to suddenly check raise a complete banana hand because, you know, you think, okay, my opponent's over c-betting. No, remain in this order, up the frequency, and you will already probably reach a very high percentage. All right. So if you guys got any questions, there's the chat. We will now dive into a couple of boards. All right. And I will show you guys these points in practice. I separated a couple boards for you guys. Starting off with the Queen 6-5. So I used I think mainly button versus big blind examples, and you will use one under the gun versus big blind example. So basically, I wanted to kind of show you guys what happens if the positions are tight. But I think studying most button versus big blinds is probably going to be best because that's going to be the most frequent spots. Someone says Jack 7-6, King 5 of hearts should function as a backdoor extra check raise. No, because it has a flush draw. So on Jack 7-6 heart, Ace 8 with a heart is an over, a backdoor flush draw, and a backdoor straight draw. For example, Queen 6-5, Ace 7. So we can see here, Ace 7 with the ace of diamonds is a check raise candidate because it has an over to the queen. It turns a lot of open enders and it turns flush draws, if that makes sense. So as for your strong draws, for example, if you look at Ace X, usually you see here King Jack of diamonds, Ace 10 of diamonds are check raised at a lower frequency than some of the other flush draws. And the reason for that is because these hands can always call. I mean, King Jack, can they always call? So not flush draws. I mean, there's two reasons. Villain will c-bet fold a lot of dominating hands. So, for example, if villain c-bets and we check raise, okay, it's going to fold all these dominating King X and a lot of the dominating Ace X. So one of the benefit of not check raising King Jack of diamonds and Ace 10 of diamonds is that we keep dominating hands in. That's one. And most importantly, Ace 10 of diamonds can always just call the turn. So if we check call flop, there's no turn that we basically have to fold. So we can always realize our equity. Okay, so these are two main reasons why the higher draws don't always get check raised. All right. Basically, they have more EV in the check call than, for example, a shitty flush draw, which would often have to fold the turn. And if, for example, a hand like 9-7 turns a 7 or a 9, it's often dominated. All right. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So when I say one over, I mean one over to the top card. But yeah, it has two overs. So Ace 4, for example, you still see some check raise frequency. It's the same concept. But Ace 7 is obviously better because that 2 overs to the 6 and Ace 4 only has 1 over to the 6. But yeah, we start, if you look at the range here, like I said, value, if you look, it only gets called 28%. Okay. Like I said, you can just, as a guideline, in my opinion, check raise it all. On rainbow boards, you will, for example, if we make this the 5 of clubs, and if we then look at the slow playing frequency, it's very little, only 15.9% calls. So the reason it's slow play sometimes on the diamonds is because there's more turns that are going to interact with the board, and basically the imposition call range versus the check raise will contain more equity, and therefore we check raise less. But I think as a general guideline, just usually play your value fast. Okay, that would be my general advice. And if we look at the draws, combo draws, obviously flush draws, open enders, very strong hands. If you look at open enders, as you can see, a higher equity draw gets check raised way more often than a gut shot. Okay, so in the hierarchy, we talked about it. The strong draws first, unless your draw is very strong, as you can see, flush draw to the nuts. And you can see it here very clearly. The lowest is going to get check raised at a higher frequency than the highest. The deuce is good on blockers. Is a good on blocker, so probably Villain also folds more to check raise. He also folds like some dominated ace X. So there's a lot more going on. Cleaning outs, ruffles it exactly. Then after that, we'll see the backdoor flush draw 2 cards, higher frequency the backdoor flush draw 1 card, higher frequency than no draw. Okay, so you can also see that in hierarchy, and you will see that back. All right, so some bottom pairs, by the way, as you can see, pocket deuces with a diamond and a heart. We see some check raise frequency. We see the 5-3, the 5-4, like these bottom pairs. These are very mergy type of hands. You will often see them, maybe also hand like ace 5, for example. Yeah, I can see that in there. Ace 6. You'll see middle pair with top kicker. Actually, is also quite a frequent check raise candidate on a lot of boards. And these hands will be a bit of your mergy hands on the turn, but we will look at that a bit later. All right. So this is all great. Now I wanted to look at the next board, which is A6-5. Why did I choose A6-5? I just changed one card because there's no more over and backdoors. Remember, I said you need to look for an over and a backdoors. But what do we do if those cards are no longer present? Well, we get to check raise our other draws in order to reach a certain frequency more frequently. And as you can see here, if you look at the amount of low pairs and third pairs that we're now going to check raise, it's going to be at a higher frequency than in the other example, because in the other example, we had the other preference, which was an over and a backdoors, but we don't have that here. So in order to still reach the check raising frequency that we want, we need to dig lower in the preference. Remember, I gave 4 preferences. And the last one is the low pairs. So if they're not present, we're going to check raise these hands at a higher frequency. Okay. That's actually the main point that I wanted to make on this flop. The other things will play quite straightforward. Also, another thing actually that I want to mention on the Queen 6-5 as well, you don't really do much check raising with top pairs. The check raise ranges on the boards that I'm showing here are pretty polarized. Okay. And therefore, also you can see here it leans more towards pot on the A6-5, whereas on the Queen 6-5 it leans way more towards half pot. But as I mentioned, if you just go 3/4, you probably you usually hit it, in my opinion. But what then happens if we remove the flush draw? Because flush draw was a big part of our check raising range. So if you were check raising these overs, these flush draws, your check raise frequency will drop tremendously when a board suddenly becomes rainbow. Again, if you look at now open and the straight draws, almost check raised 75% of the time. So the check raise frequency with the open and straight draws is increasing when we remove other options of hands. Same with the gut shots. And again, same with the second pairs, low pairs. Now suddenly we're already check raising it 17%, 16, 17% of the time. So we will increase our check raise frequency with these candidates. Okay. Does that make sense? So for the people who are, a lot of people will over check raise the first board because there's too much candidates, and then they will under check raise a board like this, or even worse, a board like this, because they're looking for the draws. Well, on King 7 deuce, there's no draws. So that's the problem. There's no flush draws. There's no straight draws. So if you're used to check raising equity, then on King 7 deuce, you're going to struggle. So you need to know what comes below that. And you get the backdoor flush draw with 2 cards. They're going to be very important. Here we see the middle pair top kicker, as I mentioned. It's like a thin value raise. If a hand like 9-10 folds is good results, we probably get called by any lower pair than the 7. All the pairs will call, or the 7x will par. So it's a bit of a mergy check raise, which you can definitely add on boards that are a bit drier. I definitely think it's a good play. A backdoor straight draw here would be actually ace-5. As you can see here, the ace-3, the ace-4. They get check raised at a very high frequency. These would probably be your first check raising candidates. Ace-3, I would say, is your first check raise candidate on a board like this. If you decide to bluff, you can also see the ace-5 offsuit is even in there. So it doesn't even have a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. And then the 8-9 suited is a very high frequency check raise with the backdoors. It has like 2 overs to the 7. It turns a lot of open ends, so it has a lot of barrel opportunities. So ace-3, 8-9 suited. These are going to be very good check raising candidates. And then like some bottom pairs. Same you could say for a hand like 4-3. Can sometimes turn a flush draw, turn some open enders. 5-4, 5-6 as well. Basically in the low end it connects. So on these type of boards, the bluffs will contain less equity, and therefore people will find them less frequently. All right, if that makes sense. So I hope there's some people out there that are like, oh yeah, I will probably check raise too much on the first one, check raise a little on the last one. Well, here is your fix. All right. I wanted to then look at one example, I think that's under the gun versus big blind, King 5-4. Now this would actually be one of these boards that I mentioned that could get over c-bet. If you look at the c-bet frequency, it has to check 45.6% of the time. If you would only give it 1/3, it can definitely bet a little bit more. But boards like ace-5-4, and I think this board, if you look at the c-bet frequency, a6-5 two-tone, 56% checks. Now, these are boards that are very frequently over c-bet. And so these are boards where you can definitely increase your check raise frequency as I suggested, okay? So if we look here at the check raising range, you see a lot of check raising going on with your draws, I suspect, but also a lot with your second pairs and third pairs. This is the highest frequency that we have seen, okay? Because here we have a big nut advantage in terms of, we have some exclusive hands like 5-4 suited, which under the gun doesn't always have, fours, which under the gun doesn't always have, king 5 suited, king 4 suited. And not only on the not only now on the flop, as I mentioned, but if cards start to connect around the deuce to the 8, we will again have an advantage, because if you look at our range, if I remove these filters, we have like some of these 6-7 offsuit. We have like a lot of hands here in this region. So as soon as those cards start to connect, you can maybe give a spoiler. Let's say we check raise, villain calls, and let's say turn connects around this area. Basically, we bet range for a big sizing. And why is that? Because if you look at the nut advantage that we have here, it's huge. We have a huge nut advantage. So because if you think about which hands we have in our range that villain doesn't have in their range, this is something that you should always think about. So if you look at the boards that in position as initial razor, for example, is going to be very aggressive on, it's usually around some exclusive parts of the range that connect with him and not with you, right? That's what gives an equity advantage. So here we can not only look at the flop and think like, oh, this is a good flop for me, but also look ahead and think like, hey, there's a lot of turns where we have nuts where our opponent doesn't have nuts. So basically knowing that, we can already invest a little bit more money on the flop because we know we will have good bluff opportunities on the later streets. Now we can do the same for the turn. We can already look ahead, barrel a bit more turns where a lot of rivers are going to connect well with our range. So we have good bluff opportunities on the river. And these are spots where a lot of people, if they only stick with, you know, like a very, I would say, a very honest range on these type of cards, basically you can already bet range in theory, but there's a lot of these cards where you can bet a lot. So it's, I think in my opinion, it's good to already add like some more bluffs when good cards hit for your range to have a bit more bluffs. Okay. Those merging hands will be useful as an extra bluff when our natural does hit the turn river. Exactly. Rafa already put it. If you look at the 4x and 5x that we check raised here, I mean, there are going to be hands that are now going to blast off. I mean, obviously on a 6, it's a bit, but I think actually on a deuce, probably we still bet range. Okay, we don't bet range, but we're getting there. If you look at the bottom pair, region, second pair, third pair, low pair, 80% betting. Okay, like a 5-6 is always betting pure. Okay, it's very clear. And that's because it blocks some of the nuts in villain's range. So it will just use it to blast off, basically. All right. So you see the same on ace high boards on the a6-5, basically. If we start check raising a 5, for example, it's usually to blast off. All right. Whereas if you would only check raise draws, you get to a lot of rivers and be like, okay, all the draws miss. I have a lot of draws. And then a lot of the draws also block his folding range, so you don't have any good type of bluffs. So add, like, especially in these tighter formations, you want to add a lot of 4x and 5x to the range. Why does 5-7 suited have a higher checking frequency than, for example, 5-6? I would have no clue. I would probably, I mean, wait, on a deuce, obviously 6-5 has a gutter with the deuce. So yeah. On a 9, probably 7-5 will bet more than a 6-5. No, wait, obviously on an 8, but that's the same. Yeah. So basically, a deuce till an 8. If I would have check raised a deuce till the 8, I would just consider as nuts, and I would I would just go for it. So recognizing like another advantage now because of an exclusive part of our range, and then not advantage in the future are boards where you can definitely invest, especially in combination with also over c-betting. So the king 5-4 here in tighter formations, and in general, like the ace low lows, flush draw are very good boards to attack a lot with check raises. All right. So I talked about that. I talked about what happens if there's no draw. So what happens if the flop becomes very connected? I talked about not slow playing, but if you look at, for example, a 2-pair hand, what's a 2-pair hand? Let's say 10-8. And we look at the amount of equity and like 2-8, it's a 2-pair, but it's relatively a pretty poor hand because it only has 67% equity on a board that's very drawy. Where, for example, on 6-5, if we look at 2-pair, what's 2-pair here? 6-5, and the amount of equity it has. already has 80% equity. So yes, absolutely speaking, same hand, but given the dryness of the board and the fact that we play a high SPR, we cannot start investing with this amount of money. Now, if we have an SPR where we can just check raise and jam turn, like for example in a tournament, then by all means go for it, you know. But when a high SPR, when we still have to play river, we have to take all the nasty things that can happen on late streets in consideration, and therefore we cannot check raise straight away with our two pairs. Okay, so take it a bit more easy. For example, never check raise any bottom two pairs. You can check raise the top two pairs at a higher frequency. That's kind of the guideline that I personally use in this kind of situations. Now, also there's, if you look at the strategy, and if we remove this filter, where's the filter? If you look at the overall strategy, we have a lot of hands to choose from. On these two-tone boards, for example, here you have a hand like King 9, which is an open-ender. Always pick the one that has the backup equity. So the one with the heart, okay? As you can see here, it's quite a clear heuristic. If we have an open-ender, we prefer to have the heart. If we have an open, we prefer to have the heart, okay? It's a very clear heuristic you can use. The last board I want to look at is a very high-frequency check-raise board, which is the 866. Now, I'm not looking at other low boards because they're usually not c-bet for a 1/3 sizing. If people do check c-bet a board like 8-6 deuce or something for 1/3 sizing, same concepts will apply. We want to check raise quite aggressively for a small sizing because a lot of hands in our range benefit from protection / thin value. Basically, in practice, I would say you could even check raise a bit more than this. Attack these board quite hard, okay? See the c-bet frequency here is, I think on overall, if these low pair boards, the check-in frequency should be a little bit higher. And in practice, I see the betting frequency be a bit higher. Therefore, I like to attack these boards a little bit more. But yeah, basically you can check raise. That it's very hard to show a clear trend in the check raises. Obviously, there will still be a clear trend as we explained. Like the open end is more, the gut shot less, the back to two flush draws less, no draw less. The heuristics here are still there, but in terms of pairs, I mean, it's check raising any pair at a certain frequency. Okay, so usually if you have some sort of potential, I would say go for the check raise. I don't think you can go much wrong here. Any questions when it comes down to the flop? We will talk more about how to play turn and rivers after we check raised. But if there's any more questions about flop play, do now shoot your questions so I can answer them. Also, we'll go back to the presentation and give you guys some guidelines for turn and river. King Jack suited, King 10 suited. Also here, for these combinations, again, choose backdoors, just like I showed on the Jack 10-8. Here you pick a heart. Here you probably pick more the hearts, the clubs, the diamonds, more equity. King Jack suited, King 10 suited. When a check raises, no, it's just, I mean, it does get called by worse, but it also folds out better, folds out worse. I mean, King 10 suited, it has a backdoor straight draw. Did King Jack also sometimes check raise? King Jack. I have no clue what King Jack is doing. I would not check raise King Jack personally, but obviously for a solver knows both each other's ranges. So for the solver, it's very important to have a little bit of everything, right? Board coverage. Whereas if you're a human and you would say, listen, I always check raise King 9. I never check raise King 10, King Jack. That's a perfectly solid strategy because your opponent doesn't know your exact strategy. How would you exploit someone you think's over check raising? Would you develop a flop 3-bet range? For sure, unlike lower boards, I think actually low boards, actually, this does apply if you see that 1/3. If you look at population data, most pools, they do, or these not the lower stakes pools, I guess I haven't looked at it, but if you look at the pool for mid stakes and up, they actually reach a higher check raising frequency than Pio. Then on these low boards, if there's no straight, you can definitely build c-bet check 3-bet ranges. So basically, let's say you have a board that you would use a big sizing on, let's say Jack 6-4 or something, 9-6-4, sorry. So it's 9-6-4. If your opponent check raises a lot, basically, instead of betting big, you can just bet small, and when he check raises, you 3-bet. That's a very solid strategy, in my opinion. That's how you would exploit someone who check raises more. Another way you can exploit someone who check raises more, this is a very easy adjustment. If you have a hand that doesn't every hand that you check raise, that you c-bet, he check raises and you kind of puke fold, I usually say. So they're almost strong enough to call, but not really, so you have to fold. Those are the hands you should just check. If you have a shit hand and he check raises a lot, doesn't matter. You just c-bet, check raise, you're like, if you call, it also doesn't matter. You just call. It's all the puke hands in the middle that should become checks versus high check raises. What about the 4-3 with backdoors? Why wouldn't that work here? Too little equity. I mean, opponent is not folding that much, 37% check raise, but I think 4-3 just probably blocks some of the bet folds. As you can see here, the bet folds are all in this region and this region. So 4-3 blocks the bet folds and it has very poor equity. So therefore it doesn't check raise. All right. Let me shoot up my presentation. We are at flop. We already looked at the GTO wizard, how it constructs the flop check raising ranges. It's hopefully very clear for everyone now. Now let's move on to the turn. Turn guidelines after check raising. So just as on the flop, why do we check raise more on rainbow than on two-tone board? So this is kind of what I just explained on all the way in the beginning, I think Queen 6-5. So on a two-tone board, there's more cards that are going to shift the equities because a flush can let's say you have top pair. Okay. Let's say you have king queen on Queen 6-5 and you check raise and the turn brings a flush card. Sometimes you're dead. Okay. Whereas on the rainbow boards, you will always have some equity on the turn with king queen. So usually in all scenarios in poker, all scenarios is a big word. In most scenarios in poker, when the board is two-tone, you usually slow down a little bit more. And when the board is rainbow, you have kind of green light to start investing in the pot because there's less equity switching turns and rivers that you could possibly lose the pot on. Okay. So you see the same imposition as an initial razor. If you would compare rainbow boards with two-tone boards, rainbow boards, it just gets c-bet at a way higher frequency than on two-tone boards. Same out of position as the razor, basically in all situations. Exception would be low SPR situations because there sometimes we bet very big in order to jam turns. If you want to know more about that, I think I did a webinar about 3-bet pots a very long time ago, but I explained that concept there. Right, continuing on turn guidelines after check raising. So as always, it goes betting. It's always based on the equity. So the higher your equity, the more the card improves your range, the more we bet and vice versa. All right. We showed that on the King 5-4, right? On a deuce to 8, we can basically barrel range because on the flop we already had a certain nut equity advantage, some exclusive hands that our opponent didn't have, and that only got added on a deuce to 8 turn. If the turn is an ace, we should probably slow down a bit more. Now, as for sizing, okay, your default sizing is going to be 2E, which means that it's a geometric sizing, which means that you're going to divide the stacks to get the money in by the river. You want to do this because you have a lot of nuts in your range and you're trying to get the money in. If you use a smaller sizing, this is actually a very high EV mistake. So on flops, for example, people usually play around with sizing. They say, oh, I can do this, I can do that. It doesn't really cost much EV. But if you have a lot of hands like sets to pairs, a lot of strong hands in your range, and you disallow the solver to go towards direction all-in, this is actually a spot where you lose a lot of EV in your strategy. So it's very important to set up stacks for the river, okay? So therefore, we usually go to E. 100 BB, this is usually around pot. So I think in some of these sims, it check raised 50% pot. So therefore, the stack to pot ratio on the turn is a bit different. So you go 125%. Let's say you check raise 3/4. When you're a bit deeper, like 150, we might always overbet the turn 125%. Basically, you just find the size for which you can set up around a pot size shove on the river. All right. We only start sizing down when draws complete and the board becomes wet. That gives nuts in villain's range now and in the future. Again, future because of the high SPR. Okay. When villain also has nuts in his range, we have to slow down. Okay. If you go to E, so set up stacks for a river, in this case, pot, where villain has nuts in range, you are isolating yourself towards another part of villain's range. So how poker works, the bigger you bet, the more your opponent is allowed to fold. and which are the first hands that your opponent folds, the weaker equity holdings. So if you bet very big in a spot where villain has a lot of strong hands, like 80% plus equity hands, it starts to fold all the lower equity hands. And then at some point, if you are trying to value bet a hand that has like 70% equity, you're basically isolating yourself only versus better parts of villain's range. Okay. It's very important. Basically, in all scenarios, actually, this is the case. Okay. You want to value bet more than just a good flush. So let's say it's the queen 6-5, turn is a flush. If you have two pair or a set, you cannot really bet pot because your equity when called is just going to be too poor. All right. But also we don't really want to check because then we just give him free equity. Okay. We need to charge him. But in order to still value bet a hand like two pair, we need to size down. All right. Also, you still need to play river. So let's say the turn brings a flush. I don't know, top of my head, maybe like 15%, 20% of the time. A 4 flush comes on the river, which probably, I don't really know who that gives an advantage, but I would, especially if you go 2E, it will definitely give the advantage to the in-position player. So because we still also have a river to play, this is more true in general in drawy boards, all right? I will show you this in a second. Again, talking about the characteristics of the bluffs, value always easy to find, but how can we find the bluffs? We look again for the strong draws, the flush, the open-enders. After that, the weaker draws. And after that, like some merges, we talked about check raising bottom pairs. Now, these are hands that usually start to become bluffs on turn. Unblockers plus good future bluff candidates. Actually, I added this in here. This is actually something I do, and afterwards I checked solver. Sometimes I saw it, not always. But this was kind of what I was talking about. If you see a lot of good rivers to bluff on for your range, I like to sometimes add certain hands that actually I saw solver giving up quite often. But I like to put them in there because on the river, the better the card is for your range, the more you get to bluff. So, and the more effective also your bluff becomes. So sometimes if I see a lot of good rivers to bluff on, I might add a couple of bluffs on the turn. All right, in before getting exploited. Some river guidelines. I don't want to get too deep into the river. There have been webinars already given, and usually the mechanics are quite the same. In general, the more your range improves, the higher your bluff allowance, the more you can fire, and vice versa. On the river, split between block and jam, or play block only on flush completing river. So let's say it's queen 6-5 two-tone, turn is a blank, we bet pot, and river brings the flush. And just like if the turn brings the flush, it's a spot where we cannot just jam the money in, because if villain just calls and starts at the top, we will just value down ourselves with two pairs, sets, etc. He will call with a better hand than us way too frequently. Okay. In order to fix that in all situations, you usually size down, so you get called by more hands that are worse than your, for example, two pair or sets. Okay. I hope everyone understands either turn or river when the flush completes. And if you jam all your stack in, a very big part of Villain's calling range is going to be a flush, right? And we don't want that if we have two pair. Given we are usually working with very few combos once we reach the river, your blockers and unblockers to call and folding range are going to have a very big impact on the outcome and will increase in importance when bluff allowance is lower. So if your bluff allowance is very high, as we saw in the king 5-4-8, for example, we could bet range. So you can say, I have a very bad hand, or this is not the best hand to bluff, or no, you were barreling range because it was a very good card. So here, if a very good run out comes, we might still bluff a very shitty hand to bluff, okay? Because our bluff allowance is very low because we have such a strong range. Whereas if everything breaks and the turn and river did not improve our range or even improved his range, we have to slow down. Then being very careful with which bluffs you pick is going to be very important because we already have low fold equity to begin with. So it's very easy for a bluff to become minus EV. How to split in a smart way the bluffs for the blocking range and the shoving range. I will show you that in an example, but basically, you usually want to jam, for example, a very good flush. So if you have a bluff, that's probably going to be the very good flush blocker. Okay, that's kind of how it's going to work. You want to have blockers. So basically, if you jam a very big, I think I heard Don Corleone talk about this in river bluffing video. He used a very expensive word. I actually had to look it up on Google. He said, yeah, I don't think I can even think about it. He said, when Vin's brains is homogeneous, I think that was, I could be butchering this. Don't take my word for it. But basically, a very big part of Vin's calling range on the river when you jam is going to be a flush. So therefore, you want to block the calling range. Okay, you want to bluff with a not flush blocker, for example. Whereas if you bet very small, okay, his calling range is going to be a little bit more all over the place. So then you just want to have unblockers to the folding range. Okay, so if you go all in, you want to have blockers to the calling range. If you bet very small, you want to have just unblockers to the folding range. Okay, that's kind of how you divide it. Would definitely recommend checking out the video that he made. Attack spots where people have over c-bet and possibly called flop and turn. Common one, in my opinion, are these ace xx textures. If people c-bet too much of the middling pairs like nines, tens, jacks, queens, kings, they will often call the flop. They might turn a flush draw with all these middling pairs. They call the turn, and then they are forced to fold the river. Okay, so these are good spots to be very aggressive. All right. If you guys got any questions, ask in chat. And let's now open GTO Wizard and see how it plays turn and river after check raising. All right. So I want to actually just start back at the beginning, or at least that was my idea. And now I wanted to look at turns. Let's do this create future reports. No, I want to see reports of turns. And what I wanted to show you guys was suits. Because here you can see it very clearly. If the turn is a club, heart, or spade, which sizing do we dominantly use? 75 to 125%. Like I said, usually it's roughly around pot. This is going to be the geometric sizing. We want to use that to get the stacks in, okay? It's a clean turn. Let's go, all right? But on a diamond, as you can see here, flush completes, we suddenly have to size down, usually half pot or lower, okay? So let's look first maybe at the strategy on a blank. It's going to be, I guess, more common, right? Very big sizing, direction all in. If I have a flush draw, actually I was surprised by this, but this is a bit tricky. Flush draw nuts. This is a bit tricky. I'm personally not a big fan. And on some boards it does it, some boards it doesn't. I haven't really found out the heuristic. But if you bet 125%, Vin is actually going to fold like a lot of the dominating flush draws. So usually if I did check raise a hand like ace-8 of diamonds, I usually check call the turn instead. But maybe I'm just overvaluing this concept and underestimating fold equity. Apparently, this is the case. If you look at the hands again, combo draws, flush draws, open and straight draws. Again, if you pick like 7-8, usually the one with the diamond will have the higher frequency. Back to filters. Gut shots, that's an open-enders. Again, if you pick one, the 8-9 is probably with the diamond, not without the diamond. And we again see the low pairs. The times that it did check raise, it's always firing. Oh, no, wait. So that's third pair in this case. It's always firing, and it's a bit mergy because, you know, Vinin will probably, let's say we have 5-8 or 5-7. I imagine Vinin will call with a hand like pocket fours with a diamond, 5-4, and it will probably fold a 6. It will also call with flush draws. So that's probably what's going to happen. 5-4 indeed calls. So we have 6-7, or 5-7. We're actually getting some value out of these low pairs with a diamond, the 5-4, and it's folding some better hands. And it's calling with a lot of the flush draws that we can actually show down against. Okay. And again, it's a good blocker bluff on a lot of rivers. All right. So a hand, for example, but it picks ace-5. Ace-4 obviously turns a gutter now. And that's why we were flop raising with backdoors, straights, flushes. So if a card like this comes in, we actually turn a straight draw, so we have more equity, and therefore we can barrel. But for example, a hand like ace-7 with the ace of diamonds, I wouldn't mind firing, to be honest. It probably doesn't do it because maybe the 7 blocks a lot of the folding range. But this is, for example, a hand that I wouldn't mind firing because we can fire a 9, an 8, a 4, a 3, a diamond. So with ace-7, personally, I see quite a lot of potential. So this would definitely be a hand that I would add in there as a bluff. Let me see. How would you exploit someone who bets medium hands too often on the turn and usually bets a size equivalent to their hand strength? So basically, he's telling you what he has. Well, if you then have a medium strong hand, then if you have a bluff, that benefits because you check, you attack the weaker sizing and you fold versus the bigger sizing, or you attack the check. That's one. If you have a hand like ace queen and you did check raise it, let's say we have ace queen here, no diamond. I guess that could be a hand that you could check. If you bet small, you could either check raise, check call, maybe dunk some rivers, and when he bets big, you can just fold. Usually it's the hand strength ace queen that I think benefits from this tendency. When you have a texture that you expect to get over defended on early street, like ace xx, how do you shift your flop check raise range to exploit that? Well, you add, basically you're going to add more bluffs because you're going and especially more 6x and 5x because your plan is to barrel off. So to get to that, let me just show you this example. If people see bet too often, too much ace x, too much pairs in the middle, you will check raise more 5x and 6x because he's forced when you check raise. If he did see bet these hands, he's forced to call the ace x, forced to call the pairs. And then basically, he will end up with a lot of folds on the river. Now there's some other boards, especially let's say it's, let's say even on this board. Let's say you check raise towards pot. Now these are actually spots where villains should already start folding quite a lot of ace x straight away on the flop. Now this is a spot where a lot of overcalling, in my opinion, tends to, or at least this spot is sensitive for overcalling. Let's put it that way. It's sensitive for overcalling. Let's say turn is a 9 and you bet 3/4. A lot of the ace x should be dumped straight away. But people can be sticky with an absolute strong hand. I mean, they have ace king. So these are actually boards where I would definitely, if I check raise and you play versus someone who's, how do I say that? Who makes this mistake, then tripling off is a very good strategy because they're left with too many weak hands in their range. So in general, I would say these type of boards are very good to triple off. Same with this hand, this board. And like I said, you choose a 6 and a 5 because your block here, villains strongest hands in villains range. How to practice drill this in the app? I mean, in the app, you just select we are the big blind. I think you can select that we have check raised. Then you can just play turns. Or you can just roll very aggressive and just fold if you don't have a check raise candidate and just always check raise when you have a check raise candidate. That's how you can best drill the spot. Totally overcalled, Rafael says. Well, we agree. I mean, totally overcalled. So it's easy to overcall that spot, right? So coming back, we looked at suits. I wanted to look at cards. Also, if you look at the deuce, the 3, the 4, 5 and the 6, actually, no, actually, we didn't check raise that much. 5 and 6, 7, 8. These are all very good cards for us. And basically, the higher it gets, let's say turn is an ace. He will sometimes have ace 6, ace 5, ace queen, aces. And let's say we have 6, 5. Yeah, then the ace is not very good. There's more rivers that are going to counterfeit our 6, 5. So the better a card for a range, the more we can barrel, as I mentioned. Now let's look at a flush turn. That's where it gets interesting. Right, strategy plus EV in terms of the equity. So we have actually a very good equity, as you can see here. We have an equity advantage basically in 2 pair plus. This is, I believe, yes, 2 pair plus. But the problem is if we start betting very big, villain's range is going to fold basically these hands, right? Now I guess these hands first, then a lot of these hands, and basically his calling range is going to be very diamond heavy. So if a river is a diamond, we're a bit fucked. And if we bet very big on a river again, we can no longer value bet our sets to pairs because we're just isolating ourselves versus a flush too often. Therefore, even though we have an advantage, we size down. Now, there's a very big difference between a completing card here on the king 5-4 under the gun versus button. If you look at the range, because here we have the equity advantage. The equity advantage is not shared like in the other example. So here we can just bet very big because if we bet very big here, let's say we bet 125% pot. If you look at the response, villain will still call. you look at one pair, let's say over pair, top pair. Did I say this correctly? We bet over pair, top pair is always calling. Oh, wait, I said two pair. That makes sense. So it's only folding top pair 52% of the time. Whereas on the flush completing card, if we would overbet, look at villain, top pair, over pair, it's calling only 35% of the time. And the times that it's calling, it's going to have a diamond. So extra equity versus your hand, right? So that's trouble. So to solve this, in order to still keep on value betting a lot, we size down to block, okay? Block or half pot, somewhere in that region. Now, how do we then maneuver the river? This is a very important point. And on this board, I will quickly take a look at it. Board pairs, let's say it's a 5. I think this is where we will split because we will have 2 pairs. So here we have a big bet and a small bet probably. It's a bit all over the place. I think if you would just run 30% and do this correctly? Check, bet, raise, call, bet, call. Yeah, if you would just fill in a big bet and a small bet, it will split between that. That's what I usually recommend when you see this. You kind of merge 10%, 35%, and a little bit of 6% together, and you merge these two as well together. And that's kind of how your split is going to look. Okay. And as I mentioned, I think before, as you can see here, if we jam, a very big part of Vinny's calling range is going to be a flush. So if we use a bluff, okay, it's probably going to be with the ace of diamonds. Whereas if we have 8, 9, we don't have 8, 9. Yeah, if we have 7, 8 of hearts, you never really want to jam. Okay, if you're going to bluff something, you're probably going to bet it small because you don't block any of the calling range in the big sizing. Maybe Jack 10 is a better example. Jack 10 is mainly bet small, even with the 10 of diamonds. I was going to say that's probably also because versus jam, it even sometimes folding a low flush, but obviously it's never folding the nut flush. Oh, wait, the board is paired. My bad. That's why it's still folding. So maybe I will give a different example where the board is not paired. Where he's obviously always calling a nut flush. Yeah, but here we never, basically on most rivers, what I would recommend is after we've downsized the turn is to mainly only downsize the river and keep our range intact. This way, also because the SPR to jam is still quite big. So this way, in my opinion, it plays a little bit more unexploitable. Yeah, that would be my recommendation. Let me see. Totally overcalled. What about draws that hit a weak medium pair on turn? I mean, it's a medium pair we check. How to balance if we check call? How to balance? So basically, because on a lot of these boards, you can bet at a very high frequency, right? That I'm showing you here. The other one, we already talked about these ones, especially from an exploitive perspective. But let's say it's king 7 deuce, we check raise and we didn't improve. So let's say the turn is the 4 of hearts. Usually you will check raise you will check these type of hands. When you block the calling range, so like king 7, that's a good hand to start mixing in as a trap. But there's no clear heuristic. If we go back to the queen 6, there's no clear heuristic here, in my opinion, of a strong hand. Probably you go back to the 2 pair again, but it's not even a trap. Like if you look at the strong hands here, there's no real heuristic. Everything just checks sometimes. So in this spot, actually, this is good to know for imposition. If people check towards us, there's no clear trap in the checking range. So it's very likely that this spot is under trapped. So therefore, we can be very aggressive if people do check towards us. So yeah, how to balance? I mean, this is almost impossible to balance in practice. You would have to use an RNG. Be like, oh, I have a very strong hand, but 10% of the time, it's not that strong. I guess if you want to slow play something, let's say turn is a 10. Trying to think like a low flush, in my opinion, would make sense. But like I said, flushes are mainly betting. So my thought process here, if I want to slow play something, it's probably 4 deuce of diamonds. Because there's still every diamond kind of screws me over. So yeah, that would be, I guess, but a 5-6, for example, I could also see checking, but that's not even a trap anymore. It's just because it's a relatively quite a poor hand. How does the check raise strategy differ on mono boards? How do people differ from GTO on these boards? So mono boards, they're even more drawy. You can basically get away with a very small check raise sizing, in my opinion. And people usually tend to oversee by those boards. But that board is even more drawy. So basically, the wetter the board, the more careful you play at a high SPR. So if the board is rainbow, as you can see on this turn, we go 2E and we go very aggressive. When the flush completes, we have to take it easy. So when there's a mono, we take it even more easy, if that's a word. If that makes sense. So yeah, I talked about the flush completing turn. Talked about barreling off with those hands. Let's look at the paired board and how the turns will play. Turns. Again, we will see a lot of dark purple. A lot of dark purple going on. Basically, only on a 5 and an 8, we see small betting. On a 5, that's probably because we have incentive to bet a 5. And basically around the 5, a small betting range is constructed. On the 8, it's probably because Vidin also has a lot of 8x, so we just cannot really be too aggressive. On all the other turns, we're just trying to leverage an advantage that we have in a 6x, or at least I would intuitively say that we have an advantage in nuts. 11.8 versus 3%. So the strategy is driven around the nuts, and therefore we have a very big sizing. If we look at the strategy, let's look at the strategy of hands that are often bet, obviously good draws, make it in there. Let's remove a flush draw so we have a bit more of an idea about shitty hands. No draw. Which no draws are we bluffing then? Gut shot. Oh, be a good bluff. You can see here ace-7 sometimes makes it. So I think an ace blocking the strongest 6x apparently seems to be a thing. Ace-5, king-queen. So basically just blockers to a 6, if that makes sense. King of diamonds. So king of hearts, king of spades. Yeah. So it's basically mainly blockers to the 6 that it's looking for, because it's not barreling the king of diamonds. What would be the worst one? King of diamonds, queen of clubs. Whereas king of diamonds, queen of clubs. Yeah, that checks a full frequency. So on the flop, if you have 2 overs that block the 6x suited, that's a great candidate to go with. I don't know if we can always also see this in the straight draw. Yeah, if you see here the 9 of diamonds, 10 of clubs is the 9 of clubs, 10 of diamonds is the one that get bluffs the least. So here our barreling range wants to be very, especially our triple barreling range wants to be very weighted towards blocking a 6. Okay, that I think is a very important one. So Jack Queen, for example, we see the same heuristic. All right, so equity and blockers to the calling range. It was the same on the a6-5. Equity with, for example, a hand like 7-8. I think we're looking at here, and a 5x or 6x that block the calling range. I think that's about it, but I think we still have a little bit of time, so I'll definitely take questions. I do feel like I might have missed something, so you guys can fill me in on what I've missed. Now, obviously, you know, there's an infinite amount of lines, but we only have 1 hour, so I think I covered the most important spots. Actually, we didn't. So let's say, for example, turn is a 10 offsuit. We go direction all in, as discussed, which here will be 125. River is one of the rivers you usually don't want to see unless you had a flush draw. Again, very important to, I would personally use more of a split between jam and block. So like 125, I think, and then some of the hands that now go into 60 will make it in jam. And a lot of the hands that will make it in 35 go to 25. Some of the hands that go in 60 probably also go to 25. As you can see here, by the way, we never have to give up, because it is an improving card for our range as well, right? We also have a lot of flush draws, but he still also has a lot of good hands. So therefore, we cannot just jam, right? If we would remove flush draws from Vinton's range, yes, then we can jam a lot. But that's not really the case. Straight complete turn. Here. Straight complete turn, double flush draw turn. All right, so let's look at the Jack 10-8. Deuce, report suits. So on spades, we're going to slow down a little bit, I'd imagine, or at least a little bit more than on others. Okay, it's very little, but here we see 12%, 3/4, 16% big. And on the blanks, we see 20% big, 6% 3/4. One thing, hearts, we see the same trend. Let me see cards. 9. I can see marriage for a lot of things. So it's a bit complicated. Yeah, a lot of checking. That makes sense. Nuts in Vinton's range. Turn and in the river. So again, these boards, and this is going to happen quite a lot, right? That a flush completes or straight completes. Therefore, we don't really check raise a lot. Maybe a 7. It's a bit better for us, maybe, than for him. Yeah, 1.3. So our betting frequency goes up. Oh, we actually, this is pretty funky. We actually overbet. Oof. Okay. I would probably not have found an overbet on this straight complete. Usually when a board completes, I either check or downsize. I would not have found an overbet. There's probably some weird shit going on here. Yeah, it's sometimes folding a 9. Yeah, I was already afraid of that. It's folding ace-9. So this there's a reason why. I mean, I wouldn't try to make people fold a 9. Okay. Welcome to Deep SPR Poker. Why would you fold a 9? Yeah, I mean, probably due to the GTO has constructed a great range that makes imposition fold a 9. So when that happens, shout out to GTO and yeah, you win. Basically, that's what my conclusion would be. So main takeaway: if there's a lot of shit turns, don't start to build a big pot. That would be my recommendation. Probably on the queen, we also range check because it's very good for him. Yeah, so basically when it's just very good for him, in order to, like, you could still have a betting range that's very strong, okay? And your betting range could actually make good money, but then your checking range loses a lot of money. So in the theory world where you want to kind of protect your range, you usually refer to a range check when the equity advantage becomes very good for imposition. In this case, 45, but especially in nuts. Okay. Double flush draw turn. That's something I was going to look at as well. So let's say 6, a bit more connectivity. Still, like usually, which example can I use? I don't think it's going to show here. Trying to think of a specific board where that would apply. I mean, it's going to always lean towards more 75. And again, that's simply because if we bet very big, he's allowed to fold more shitty hands. And because there's now an extra flush draw, he calls a lot more higher equity hands. And now instead of only having to dodge a diamond, which could make playing rivers a bit more tricky, we now also have to dodge a heart, right? So yeah, therefore, just like I think someone asked, why does two-tone get c-bet more or check raise more than rainbow? Again, the wetter the board, the higher the SPR, the less we want to invest in the pot because, you know, we have to maneuver later streets. And in general, just a general guideline, if I would see a blank here, I would bet pot. If I would see a completing card here, I would block. If the board becomes extra drawy with a flush draw, I'll usually go like 3/4. That's in general just the guideline that I use for myself. Now, is this going to be 100% accurate? No. Will it function decently in practice? Yes, I would say so. So, I think that was it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, apologies for the delay. I hope you guys learned something. If any further questions, reach out on Discord. But I definitely think there were a couple of good points in here for a 1-hour webinar. So I hope you guys took something from this. I wish you guys a lot of luck at the tables. And actually, I'll see you guys, I think, very soon again. But I have to check the schedule. All right? No problem, guys. Good luck. Good luck.